Environmental policy deals with the incentives faced by policymakers who wish to align public interest with business interest. So sounds easy, but in reality, it's a very complex sort of thing to deal with. So let's go ahead and assume that the public interests aren't going to always align with the business interest. So the public are people like you and our main interest is to not have any pollution at all. However, business interest is to have as much profit as possible, and in order to do so, they need to have a lot of production and manufacturing, and that will entail a lot of pollution. So here, the public interests are not going to be aligned with the business interest. And in order to help us with some type of compromise, this is exactly where the policymakers or the government officials are going to come into play, have a very big role. So the policymakers are trying to find some type of compromise between you and I and the businesses. However, do you really trust the government officials and policymakers to find an equitable and efficient outcome? And the answer is not always, right? We really don't trust that government that much. And when the policymakers are not able to come to some type of agreement between these two groups, it can lead to some type of government failure. So government failure occurs when public policies do not bring about an optimal allocation of resources. So their policies actually don't help us reach the socially optimal amount of goods or services in this sort of realm. It also occurs when the incentives of politicians and government bureaucrats are not in line with the public interest. And this is something that we see quite often as well, where politicians, the policymakers, they tend to fall along the lines of business interest rather than the public interest. And that is going to cause a lot of controversy and a lot of heartache for the public because we are never going to get our interests sort of known because these two aren't cahoots with one another. So remember, this is exactly where a lot of the lobbyists that we talked about do come into play as well. Another way that we can take a look at the government failure is see why it's so hard to come up with some type of environmental policy. And one of the biggest difficulties that we face is to go ahead and have some type of marginal benefit and marginal cost analysis. And environmental policymakers have to balance the interest of different generations, which is an extremely difficult task. It's just almost like when we talked about the physical capital and human capital markets. There has to be some type of upfront cost today, but we're only going to be seeing the benefits of that later on. It's a little bit easier in those markets because we're dealing with ourselves and the firms and businesses are dealing with themselves, but with environmental policy, we're the ones that are going to have to pay the cost today. But who's exactly going to be gaining all the benefits from the environmental policy or from the environment being cleaned up? It's going to be our children or our children's children, so later generations. And the question asked is, are we willing to have this upfront cost today? Are we willing to pay this cost today in order to ensure that our future generations are going to gain the benefits from that? And there's a lot of people nowadays that are not willing to make that upfront cost today because they really don't care about future generations. They only care about themselves. And in any type of environmental policy that comes into play, the government policymakers and officials have to have some choice of discount rate or some type of interest rate in order to show us what the environmental damages are going to be and what the environmental benefits are going to be as well. So take a look at a fairly simple example right here where we take a look at 3 different interest rates or discount rates and the environmental damage that's going to be caused 30 years from now. So suppose that we know for sure that we're going to suffer $1,000 worth of environmental damage 30 years from now. And the choice of discount rate tells us exactly how much do we care about this damage 30 years from now. We go from 1%, 5% to 10%. If the policymaker or the policies are going to give us a 1% discount rate, it tells us that this $1,000 worth of damage 30 years from now is exactly worth $750 worth of damage to us today. In other words, we can say that we're willing to pay $750 right now in order to prevent $1,000 worth of damage 30 years from now. So with a low discount rate, we notice that we care about future generations a lot. We care a lot about the environment. But what happens when we choose a higher discount rate? At a 5% interest rate, look how how fast the present value goes down very, very quickly. So this $1,000 worth of damage, it's only worth about $250 worth of damage today. We're only willing to pay $250 to prevent $1,000 worth of environmental damage 30 years from now. And notice what happens if we choose a 10% discount rate. Wow, that goes all the way down to about $42. So we are only willing to pay $42 in order to prevent this $1,000 worth of damage. It's only worth $42 for us. So here, the choice of discount rate is extremely important in guiding environmental policy because the choice of discount rate tells us exactly what we feel about the environment and what we feel about the current generation versus future generations. If we choose a low discount rate, we care a lot about future generations. But the higher the interest rate goes or the discount rate goes, that tells us that we place less value on future generations and care more about the current time period. So that's kind of important for us. So let's go ahead and write that down. With a lower discount rate, so think along the lines of that 1%, the lower the discount rate, the more value you place on the environment. So more value you place on the environment, meaning that you care more about future generations rather than current generations. So on future generations. So you care about your children, you care about your children's children, and so on. You're willing to make this investment to maintain the environment, to clean up pollution, to keep emissions low. So here, you care more about the future than you do the current generation. So with all of this in mind, we can go ahead and use this idea of the discount rate in order to guide environmental policy and see how economists view environmental policy and the more typical supply and demand analyses. We have a little bit of a different setup here where we talk about the marginal abatement cost and marginal damages. So once again, it's going to be some type of cost-benefit analysis in order to see what the socially optimum level of pollution is going to be. In application, this is exactly what policymakers and economists have to come to some type of agreement in order to find out what type of environmental policy is going to be best for this generation and next generations as well.